Hello there, and welcome back to The Closet Historian. I do apologize that I'm already speaking to you from the otherness of voiceover land, but I expect many of you will actually be glad to hear that my sewing parlor is actually full of all of the foyer furniture right now as I try and finish up the foyer floors so I can have a decorating video coming for you soon. There are pros and cons to this upheaval, you see. But I did promise in my last video that I would show you how I've been beading the edges, the finished edges of many of my garments, and I thought it might be nice to devote an entire video to over-explaining how I add beads and sequins to my garment projects. Alright, I just want to begin by talking about the needles I use most often for beading. I do have some other beading needles kicking around my studio, but 90% of the time I'm using these size 10 hard beading needles from the brand Beading that I find at Michael's craft store. Not sponsored, it's just my personal preference. But I'll just grab a fresh one of these to use for my demonstrations today, and I am just going to be using all-purpose sewing thread for all of the beading and sequining I'll show you today. I will just use any color of sewing thread that I have that matches either the sequins and beads I'm using, or the project itself, or the fabric. Usually those are all the same anyhow. And sometimes I will use a single strand of thread with a knot on the end, and sometimes I will have the thread doubled, so it's basically 2 strands with a knot on the end. Usually I try and use 2 strands if I'm working on the edge of something or a fringe that's going to be a bit longer and could get caught on something. But normally I don't worry about my embellishment threads snapping because I treat any item that I've worked on with sequins or beads quite gingerly, quite carefully. I'm not going to lean back on a piece of Velcro or something like that. So snapping my threads is not something I worry too much about. Now I do just have a piece of cotton muslin here to work on while I show you how I sequin things. And I'll grab some round size 6 sequins. These are flat in an iridescent beetle green sort of shade. And I will also set out some size 11 seed beads. This is a pretty standard size of seed bead. And yes, for those who are newer to this kind of thing, both sequins and seed beads do come in a range of sizes. They're pretty standardized overall. Different companies may vary a tiny bit, but of course that will be micrometers really. Now I'm going to go ahead and bring my doubled thread with a knot on the end of it. I'm going to bring the needle up through my piece of fabric, leaving the knot on the back here. Then I will take one sequin on my needle here and thread that down towards the surface of the fabric, selecting a seed bead and using that seed bead to secure the sequin down to the surface of the fabric by threading my needle back down through the center of the sequin and using that bead as a sort of knot to hold the sequin on the surface. And it's this general idea that you can build upon to create different layered, textured looks once you start combining different shapes, sizes, materials of sequin, and different shapes, sizes, and materials of bead as well. But again, threading on a sequin and then using that seed bead as a way to secure it down to the surface of the fabric, sort of riveting it in place. You can also take a sequin and then thread on several beads to create a loop or little cluster of beads on top as well. Just again, another way to create texture, vary the size of the beads or sequins to create a different look. And we can take one sequin, then one bead, one sequin, then one bead to create a little tower as well. You can create large loops of this, longer fringe versions of this, or just small pagodas like I'm about to do here. Once again, I will scoot everything down to the surface of the fabric, leave the bead on top in place, and thread my needle back through everything else so that that top bead secures the rest onto the surface of the fabric. Anytime you start stacking beads and sequins like this, you are going to need to make sure you tie off the back at tension to keep them standing up straight. Of course, the looser you leave the thread, the more floopy and fringy these little doodads become. And I'll bring the needle up through the fabric again, and I'm going to create a little tree. I believe I was calling them last time, though someone did mention they look a little bit like fungal spores, and I think that's also quite a good metaphor for these little freestanding fringes. I have here some Miyuki brand 6mm bugle beads. Bugle beads are these long cylindrical beads like this. They do come in, again, many different sizes and finishes and even twisted versions, but I will thread on one of those and then my sequin and bead on top of it to kind of elevate that sequin and bead off the surface of the fabric, using the bugle bead as a sort of tree trunk to my sequin here. This is again a great way to add volume and texture and height to any embroidery project, and especially bead and sequin embroidery work on apparel. You can, of course, also thread a sequin on first, then the bugle bead, then the sequin and bead on top. So sandwiching that bugle in between 2 sequins. You can use the same idea of bead as rivet to create hundreds, if not thousands, of different effects. And now we have this kind of barbell sitting here on the surface of the fabric. And again, just remember that your trees will stand tall as long as you have the thread held at tension, so you may want to put a few knots in the back to hold these at the correct tension so they will stand up straight if that's what you're going for. And if you want things to floop over a little bit more like fringe, give this a little bit more slack before you tie anything off. But of course you can vary the height of this sort of thing by stringing on more bugle beads, which is again something you saw me do in my last video when I was working on the iridescent jacket project here on the channel. So I have strung on 2 bugle beads, and I did string on a size 15 tiny seed bead in between those two. That's just because sometimes bugle beads can have rather sharp edges and will cut your sewing thread, so I will sometimes use the rounded edges of a seed bead to avoid the sharper edges of the bugle beads. But you can see my longer doodad here, springing off the surface of the fabric. Again, that's because I'm holding it at tension in the back. It's all down to the thread tension there, whether or not they stand up straight. But all of these sequins have been sewn on using the exact same technique, using a bead to secure them in place. These all just represent minor variations on the exact same idea. And again, I did use this standing sequin technique all down the center back of this iridescent jacket. I have a lot of sequins floating up off the surface of the fabric here to add a sparkling both visual and physical depth to this garment. But of course you can just stitch a sequin into place with a stitch as opposed to using a bead to secure it down in place. You can either take one stitch and have that be enough, or you can secure it on the other side as well. And again, if you were using a contrast color of thread or something like a more textured thread like a yarn instead, you could make multiple stitches around this either in a cross or a flower pattern and do something a little bit more intentional and fun while just stitching your sequins on. And similar to this sample, personally I'm usually working in close clusters like this, so I don't mind not having a knot between each individual sequin because they're close enough together that I can still control the tension and I'm not worried about the threads becoming loose or caught on anything on the other side. If you are stitching an individual sequin or bead onto the surface and then having that thread travel more than, say, an inch across the back all by itself, I might start introducing at least a single knot before you take the next stitch, even if you are letting the thread travel along the back. And beyond an inch, personally, I would probably just individually knot each of those sequins or beads if I was having them float farther apart. And even if you are taking stitches to the outside of the sequin to hold it in place, you can still slide beads on as you do so, which again, depending on the beads you use, can create a lot of different effects. Personally, I love combining different sizes, textures, shapes, finishes of sequins, transparent versus opaque, matte finish sequins, satin finish sequins, metallic, iridescent, all sorts of different finishes of sequins, different sizes of sequins, things that are completely flat, things that are completely textured and pressed into funny shapes or even folded by me into shape. Sometimes I will take a sequin and fold it in half like a little taco to be able to layer them in different ways. In my mind, the real key to creating embellished areas is really about layering and selecting different materials and how you combine different shades of the same color, different textures of one material like sequins or of beads, allowing the mix and combination of these elements in different ways to create the overall visual depth. So that from far away something may look slightly sparkly, and the closer you get, the more there is to see. And sequins do come in very fun shapes, by the way, including cupped flowers like this, which again, I could secure down with one bead as I did initially, or again, elevate up on the stalk of a bugle bead for a true miniature garden effect. And I have some larger floral shaped sequins here as well that I could use bugle beads to create the stamens for, so that's another idea. You can get really creative with these shapes. You don't have to use them as a flower. You can use them as a star. You can use them as a building block to creating another shape. Combine them to almost look like gears or some sort of mandala. So not to get too woo-woo here, but the sequin is only flower-shaped or square or a circle if that's all you can see. Thinking outside the box and experimenting with the materials before you start working on the main body of the project can lead to some very fun discoveries. I'm just going to tie my thread off on the back here, again making sure that I have everything under tension so that most of this still stands to attention. One of my fringes did get a bit floopy up here, so I probably should have introduced a knot earlier. But of course, just as common as an individual sequin secured down with a bead, we have rows of sequins, which are usually sewn as follows. Bring the thread up from the back, thread on a sequin, and take a stitch that is about 3/4 of the width of the sequin away. And this should be able to flip back and forth because it just has the one stitch involved right now. Bring your thread up again about that same width away, thread on another sequin, and then put the needle back through just under the first sequin. So we're going to layer these. And again, varying the stitch length here is going to change the effect slightly. So I would say the most standard version of this is probably to keep the stitch length between 3/4 and a half of a sequin's width away. And you would just repeat this over and over again, either following your own whims or a pattern that you had drawn onto the surface of the fabric. But again, varying the stitch length will give you a slightly different effect here. So I'll bring the needle up again, grab another sequin, and I'm going to go ahead and make sure my stitches are the full width of the sequin this time, the full diameter of the sequin, I suppose. So I'm going to come up a full sequin away, and again, put my needle back down right past the last sequin, come up again a full sequin away, like so that I get the full circle of the sequin visible. This creates a slightly different look, of course, a little bit more open, more circular, more polka dotted, if you will, as you retain more of the full shape of each individual sequin. And of course, you wouldn't have to use flat circular sequins for this. You can use any shape and size of sequin doing something like this, including cupped sequins, which you can either have facing cup up or cup down, but I'll talk about that more in a minute. But let me just go ahead and sew on a few more here using a smaller stitch length. So this time I'm only going to make the stitches about half the width of the sequin, which will make them layer up on one another quite close, which actually does raise things up from the surface of the fabric a little bit because they are sitting on one another because they are so layered, but it removes the circular shape, and this will create a much smoother outline to the edges of your line of sequins. This, as always, is proving difficult to describe using words, so hopefully you can just see what I mean visually on screen. And your thread should look a little bit like a backstitch or stem stitch on the back of the work, still pretty clean. And this is the way that rode sequins are sewn most of the time. Usually you can flip them back and forth, especially on commercial garments, and that's not because they've been sewn by hand, it's usually just how they were sewn by machine. I always think of those pillows and things that were going around for a while, where one side of the pillow had like an image printed on the sequins, and then you could rub the sequins back and forth and kind of change the color of the sequin. Hopefully you know what I mean. But most of the time I use a different stitch to sew my sequins down a little more securely so they don't flip back and forth like that and they can't really move around much. So again, I'll come up from the back of the fabric, stitch on my first sequin here. I have switched over to a size 5 cupped sequin for this, and I will do these with the cup, like concave of the cup facing outwards. You can sew it with the dome side down as well. Depends on what you're after. But after stitching on my first sequin, I've brought the needle back up about half a sequin away from the edge of the first, and I'm going to thread on another sequin and then put the needle back down through the center of the first sequin that I had stitched down. And then I can just kind of position the sequin with my fingers either underneath the edge of the first one or on top of it. Usually I like to keep that consistent between each sequin. But again, you can vary that for some different effects. But again, I will bring my needle up out of the surface of the fabric, half a sequin away from the last one, and then thread on a sequin, take my needle back down through the center of the last sequin. And again, you could vary the stitch lengths here for slightly different effects like I had in that first row. Stitching rowed sequins with that first method actually hides the thread, so it doesn't have to match as perfectly, but sewing them the way I am now does leave the stitch on the surface of the fabric. That's what's holding these sequins down in place so they cannot be flipped back and forth. So if you don't want to see your stitches or see your thread, you might want to go with the first method just for that reason. But for me, it's more important that the sequins stay exactly where and how I want them positioned. And by the way, both of these methods look about identical on the back. But hopefully you can see here how that first method leaves the sequins free to be flipped back and forth, whereas the second stitching method does not. But let me grab another shape of sequin, a much larger sequin here, to show you how I use this technique on top of other sequins, really layering everything all together now to create different visual effects. And for this particular demonstration, I will go down to just one single strand of thread on my needle. So while this larger triangular sequin has 3 holes, I will still use beads on each of those 3 holes to hold it down in place. And again, I think this gives a rather miniature steampunk effect here, where it looks like a piece of metal that has been riveted down to the surface, or at least that's what I like to think. And while just using beads gives that sort of effect, I also like to layer in sequins as well. So I'm going to layer in a tiny 2.5 millimeter sequin underneath each bead on top of the surface of the sequin as well. So I'll thread the sequin on, and I will thread on a tiny sequin, then the bead, and again pass my needle back through just the sequins, leaving the bead on top to secure the rest in place. And this is a way of securing things down that I'm sure you've seen me use several times here on the channel for different projects. Though even with a larger sequin like this that has multiple stitch options in place, you can still elevate this off the surface of the fabric using those long, thin bugle beads like I did earlier with the individual round sequins. You could elevate just one point of this and have the other 2 points still touching the fabric for an angled triangular effect, or perhaps 2 points of the triangle and not the last, or all 3 like this to create a small triangular table on top of your project. So these are the main ways I use sequins and beads while embellishing my garments, but I also mentioned in that last iridescent jacket video that I would show you how I bead finished edges. So I will just fold my piece of muslin in half here to simulate a finished edge. This can be done on any sort of finished edge, or even on like the raw edge of a thick piece of felt if you wanted to. But I particularly like this on the hems of sleeves and the hems of jackets and along collars and things like that. Once again, I'm going to double my thread on a needle here, and I'm going to bring the needle down along the edge a little bit away from like the end point of this, and I will be beading back in the direction of that knot, so I will bead over it, and therefore it will be kind of lost in the work and not seen. But I will grab 2 size 11 seed beads, one of these Mayuki teardrop beads, and then another 2 seed beads for my first stitch. I'm going to thread those down towards the surface of the fabric, like so. Hold that in place, then I'm going to take a little loop knot around the end of that by taking a tiny stitch through the edge of the fabric here, through the folded edge in this case, or the layered edge, depending on if you have a lined garment, whatever's going on at the edge. And I'm going to put my needle in here as I tighten that knot down to the surface, so that this is kind of like a blanket stitch, if you know what that is, or a buttonhole stitch along the edge of the fabric itself, holding these beads into place. This is a tiny bit stronger because even if you snip one of these, if you get it caught on something, they don't all come out at once, which is probably better for the edge of something, because that is probably the most at-risk area for getting caught on something when you're wearing a garment, especially if it's like on your sleeve hem or something. I always figure if something gets caught and ripped off something I'm wearing, I put it there in the first place, I can put it back. So again, I never really worry about that kind of thing. But this is a little bit stronger than just couching a length of beads along the finished edge, I suppose, because you are introducing a bit of a knot into the system. So I just switched to a bugle bead surrounded by 2 size 15s, and then went back to that original pattern again, 2 size 11s, 1 teardrop bead, 2 size 11s. These are Mayuki brand bugle beads, and I find these actually are the least sharp of all bugle beads. And if you are looking for beads with the most consistent edges, size, and quality, you are going to want to look at Mayuki seed beads. And is this time consuming? Yes, very. All of this is. But is it worth it? I like to think so. Put on a podcast, listen to an audiobook, put on a playlist, you might be here a while. String on beads, take a tiny stitch out of the edge, looping that into a knot as you do, like so. Making sure everything is held at tension so that these are not loose on here. But if you do string on more beads than the size of stitch you take, they will scallop further up away from the edge. So here I've threaded on 3 seed beads on either side of the teardrop instead of 2, but I'm going to take the same size stitch that I've been taking this whole time. This will result in this strand of beads sticking out away from the edge a little bit further, creating a slightly scalloped look here. Just another way to add in a little bit more variance or difference depending on the look that you were going for. And at the end of this sort of thing, I do just loop in a couple of extra knots, pierce my needle between the layers of fabric along this edge so that I can disappear my thread into the project itself and then cut off the excess. And here, as I salvage these beads back from this sampler to put back in my stash, you can see how they actually are more secure along this edge than you would think. Now I did just want to go ahead and explain why you don't see me using tambour embroidery or Ari embroidery, I think that's how it's pronounced, the French or the Indian versions of using a tiny, tiny, tiny sharp crochet hook to do embroidery work, especially with beads and sequins. And here you can see that I do have a Luneville embroidery hook or needle, I suppose, and that is because I took a several hours long day course on tambour embroidery while studying in England back in 2012 at the Royal School of Needlework. The word tambour means drum, and it's because to do tambour or Luneville embroidery, your fabric has to be taut, it has to be stretched like the surface of a drum. So alas, you do not see me pulling out this tambour hook because, let me just tell you, from trying to do these few sequins here on unstretched fabric, it is a total nightmare to do on something that is not taut. There's a reason it's called drum embroidery, and it's because the fabric has to be held at tension. It is a method I know how to do and a skill I technically have, I just don't often put it to use because it requires knowing exactly what motifs you want to do and what kind of embroidery you want to do before the project is put together, because you cannot do it after the fact. This means you have to mount your fabric either on an embroidery hoop or more likely on a large frame to encompass like a full side front jacket piece or back bodice piece. And I would say in couture work this is done about 50-50 on the actual finished fabric itself or just on a plain silk organza, and then the motifs are cut out and applied down onto the finished couture project. But even at embroidery houses like Lesage or, say, the Royal School of Needlework, there are still certain motifs, elements, types of beads, types of stitches that have to be done purely by hand, even while the fabric is still loomed, or later after something is removed from the loom, cut out, and started to be constructed into a garment. There are some techniques and some materials that cannot be used with the Luneville hook. But in general, while tambour embroidery looks like it must be faster when you're watching the savoir-faire videos from Chanel or Dior or the different couture houses, you're not seeing the full extent of the setup, which would involve creating the embroidery pattern and a sampler and possibly even laying out where that embroidery is going to be on a mock-up or on a muslin of the final garment so you can see exactly where it needs to go, because you have to do all that embroidery work first before you can construct the garment together. And then setting everything up, stretching the fabric onto the frame and getting that all into place, that actually represents quite a lot of prep work and initial design ideation time that I certainly don't plan into my personal projects. So alas, you do not see me pulling out my tambour hook. I simply don't plan my embellishments that far in advance before construction of each garment to be able to make tambour embroidery work for me and my personal sewing practice. And for something like the jacquard jacket that you saw me working on in the last video, that fabric has threads going in every which way direction because it is a jacquard weave, and hook method embroidery is easiest to do on a plain weave fabric like, say, a silk organza. With a jacquard, it would be a lot easier to snag things along the way with that tiny little hook, so I really think only an expert could do tambour embroidery on a jacquard weave anyhow. So I'm afraid, yes, every sequin and bead you see on a finished project of mine was sewn there by hand, and that's why sometimes there are more weeks between finished videos than I should like. But as tedious as it can sometimes be, I personally love embellishing my projects, which is something you may have noticed over the last several years, and I constantly have more beaded and sequined project ideas that I'd love to work on in the future. But now, unfortunately for me, I have to go back to pretzeling myself on the floor with a crowbar, some safety glasses, and a hammer chiseling away the plywood that someone decided to nail down to the floor in front of my front door and cover with tile for seemingly no reason other than that they really wanted to bother me from the past back in 1973. I hope you still enjoyed this video today, and thank you so much for watching. And a huge additional thank you to my patrons, of course, who make my work possible. And as always, I'll be back with more sewing, vintage fashion, costuming, crafting, and decorating real soon, so I'll see you then. Bye!